Now, if we continue to look at this body of our learning that I call basic training, there's an aspect of how it gets installed and how it gets treated, which I believe needs to be addressed in general. Now, my fundamental belief is that if there's anything malfunctioning, if there's anything that does not serve us, if there's anything that becomes problematical in our later life, it's because there's been a kind of abuse, a kind of rejection, a kind of put down of some aspect of us within ourselves, that we have learned that and ingested that from the experience of the kind of upbringing that we had. Remember now, I have said that this has a lot to do with putting the responsibility on the caretakers, above all on parents, teachers, and others, right? I am not blaming them in the classical sense. I am saying they are responsible, that they are doing it, that they are doing the things which inflict the message, but they don't know it. It's out of sight. It's part of this not being aware of what's in us that we're dealing with. So, yes, they are responsible, but no, they don't know that they're doing it. So they're not intentionally do it, at least most of the time. Sometimes they do, but most of the time it's just automatic behavior. Now, what that implies is that there's a kind of lack of welcome, there's a kind of rejection, a kind of blame, a kind of guilt tripping, if you want, a making wrong of some aspect of ourselves that is inflicted, inserted, made part of our basic training. And that means that for the rest of our lives, we're susceptible to that kind of blame, that kind of darkening of our experience. And that's one of the main reasons that I think therapy can be ineffective. Because if I'm talking about what anyone is doing as mental illness, if I'm referring to it as pathological, if I'm thinking of it as something that must be cured, then the client with whom I am working is going to feel that my approach to him or her is essentially condemnatory, negative, is essentially blaming him or her with the wrongness of what he or she is doing. And that's one of the main reasons that I am hell bent on eliminating this whole reference to mental illness and the DSM and all of that kind of disorder talk, because that assumes, once again, the very thing that sets up the problem in the first place, which is that you're doing it wrong. So if you come in here filled with a body of feelings that whatever you're doing is wrong, and you're told by the therapist that whatever you're doing is wrong, what possible way could that be effective? So to pathologize it and make it mental illness and make it wrong, you see, is simply to inflict the same experience again on the individual. And in that sense, simply repeats what sets the client up for the problems in the first place. What that means is that there's a fundamental approach to any of the questions that I think is fundamental to an effective approach to basic training. And that is to assume, to know that the individual is doing something unprofitable, let's call it that, because he or she has been taught that whatever he wants, whatever she wants, whatever they're trying to do is wrong, off base, you see. And it's important to see then that anything I am subsequently doing is an attempt to heal that basic wound. Rather than being pathological in a negative sense, it is something fundamentally that must be understood as trying to make up for one of the wounds, one of the negativities that was inflicted on me in my young years, but could be happening later as well. So the one way to talk about this, I remember when I was in training, I wrote a paper where I effectively referred to anything anyone is doing as the current portrayal. And I haven't used that phrase much since, but fundamentally it determined the kind of attitude I was taking. In other words, if we're doing something that, let's say I'm systematically assuring the fact that I'm failing at business, I'm systematically doing something which botches my job, or let's say I'm drinking too much, or I'm spending too much money, or any of these kinds of things that are labeled as ineffective in life, you see, they have to be understood as an attempt to make up for one of those problems. In other words, in effect, it right now may not be profiting my life. I may not, in fact, be doing something that's really beneficial for myself if I act in this way or that way. But the most fundamental question involved is, as part of your basic training that you're attempting to deal with, how does this thing try to make up for something that was negativized, that was done badly when you were younger? The most moving example of that I have in my own experience is a client of mine who started to tell me one day about the fact that he drank too much, and that on any given day he didn't drink himself to stupor, but just had a little too much to drink. And you could see from the look in his face and the way his eyes were looking at me that he expected to be punished, that he expected to be criticized, that he expected to be denounced for this addictive behavior that he was subjecting himself to. And I'll never forget the look of surprise on his face when I very quietly asked him, I said, well, what are you trying to accomplish by doing that? What are you trying to give to yourself? And he was so unused, so unready for that question that he couldn't answer it. And we have talked about it subsequently in detail. But you see, here's where that unconscious, out-of-sight quality asserts itself. In other words, here he is doing that and aware of the fact that he was uneasy about it and wished he hadn't done it every day, but was unready to formulate, to pinpoint, to grasp that there was something positive that he was trying to accomplish by doing this kind of thing. Now, that fundamental approach, in my opinion, is absolutely, I do not know anything, I cannot think of anything that does not attempt to do that. Now, those of you who have dealt with me for a while know that my favorite example of this is Adolf Hitler, of all people. Now, do not misunderstand my meaning here. He and Stalin are in the running for the two of the most evil, harm-doing people who ever lived. There's no question of that. The real question is to understand just how he got that way, you see. And what we're really looking at here, in a certain sense, is the problem of evil itself. Why do we humans do evil to each other? Because no question Hitler did evil on a scale that was massive. But here's someone whose father was distant, cold, abusive, an alcoholic who abused alcohol and just thrashed his son to the point of terror. He'd wet his pants. He'd be terrified. And the only redeeming experience he had in any of that was his mother would come and subtract him from the father when he was thrashing him and rescue him from. But he'd be whimpering and crying and hysterical. Now, in his teen years, both the father and then the mother died, and he was on his own. When he first left home and went to Linz, the first city he lived in, he was not even anti-Semitic. He fell in love with a woman in Linz who was Jewish and couldn't be mistaken for anybody else, but hadn't been put there yet. Later, when he went to Vienna, he ran into all the anti-Semitic ideas. Yes, he did. And he aspired to be a painter. And he tried twice to be admitted to the Art Institute at the University of Vienna, and he was rejected both times. Both times severely humiliated by doing it. He later went on to Germany and entered World War I in the army, and then the rest of his political career developed out of that. Now, by that time, he is violently anti-Semitic. He's a pro-German nationalist, all of this kind of thing. And his whole stance was that he had to rescue the life of the German people by purging the elements that were going to destroy it and be evil to it. And of course, the Jews were prominently defined as that, but all kinds of enemies needed this kind of extirpation. Now, ultimately, his plan was to invade eastward into Slavic Europe, subject the Slavs to the kind of slavery to which that's abject under people they should be subjected, and establish a kind of greater Germany that would establish the life of the German people. Do you see that the definition that this creature, because that's what he was by this time, that for him to save his life and to rescue the life of the German people, thousands, not to say millions of people had to die. Now, where else would he get that lesson from than the threat of being threatened with death when he was a kid by the father who was supposed to nurture him? In other words, not to deny for 1 second that Hitler was evil. It's not about poor Adolf, nothing like that. The real point is that he went the negative route. I got threatened with death. I had to save my life. The only way to save my life is threatening others with death. So now millions of people are going to have to die. And that's essentially making Germany powerful, wrapping yourself in the power of the German army and launching it, first in Poland and then the rest of Europe, and finally precipitating a world war. To show you just how crazed that could be, on December 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war on the United States just because Japan had attacked on December 7th. And there was no need for him to do that, but he had to be in on the kill and had to be part of this. Interesting thing is that, of course, he's ultimately going to fail. He's ultimately going to lose his life, as indeed someone who doesn't know that he's been educated perversely is going to end up. You try and save your life by killing everybody else, and everybody wants to kill you, and rightly, you see. Interestingly enough, once Hitler finally fails and commits suicide in the bunker, there's only one thing in the spare, austere room in which he shot himself, and that's a small portrait of his mother. It's the only personal aspect of life that he had with him when he died. And gives you some idea of just how badly, you see, he was trained. Now, I use Hitler as my example of just how bad basic training, negative basic, life-obliterating basic training will express itself in a life-obliterating way. And if you do not see that that life needs to somehow nurture itself and feed itself positively, that simply I will go through the world inflicting the negativity. And there's how basic training can continue to be bad. You just pass it on from one generation to the other. I did not get it. I do not give it to you. I train you to not have it so that you will attempt to inflict it on the world, and so on it will go. And there's a kind of madness in the way we humans do this whole thing without understanding that the positive, life-enhancing, nurturing, positively instructed way of having our basic training is an absolutely fundamental requirement that we have to live our lives well, or else we're not going to know how to be a good elephant. We're not going to know how to be ourselves, and we're going to go around sort of essentially taking chunks out of one another with the desire to feed ourselves, to have something positive, to do something positive for our life, but we will not know how to do that because we haven't been shown how to do it. And that, therefore, to understand that the fundamental content of the need for therapy is not something to cure pathology, all right, to root out what is evil or bad or to undo it, but rather to discover what is it that we truly hope to have in ourselves and to supply that so that we can share it with each other mutually and then have this thing like elephants that don't need to beat each other up and can use our nature preserve well. And effectively, how can we get to be effective ourselves in living our lives? That's really what the positive role of good therapy would fundamentally be, would show a Hitler how not to be a Hitler and not to inflict the evil on the world. Good example of that, by the way, is, I use it as the alternative. Years ago, Mother Teresa was interviewed and asked why she did what she did. And she said, I got in touch with my ability to be Adolf Hitler. And you see, that's the opposite. That's someone who sees how she was hurt, understands how her training was not effective, and then took that as the lesson of something to be learned to give myself positively that I will then pass on positively as she aspired to do. Let's hope we can begin to study how to do that.